Here with me today I have Nicholas Willis, Program Manager for the Environmental Finance Center at Wichita State University. Nick, you can take it away.
Okay. And here we go. I put in that last polling question to always try and get an idea for an audience. That will be a theme we talk about a little bit today. Thank you for attending the webinar. This is my first webinar, so if it doesn't work well, you can blame it on inexperience. So the idea here is that most water systems are governed by some sort of board, a council, or a commission. It seemed like we had a pretty high percentage of local government run water systems. So in that sort of a board or commission, you have more likely than not elected officials making a lot of decisions about the direction the water utility is going to take. So broadly, and every type of setup, be it nonprofit, municipal, county, etc., has some differences out there. But boards of directors, commissions, and councils, they will oversee activities, and they all have some sort of duty to provide oversight to the system, which typically involves hiring and firing employees or contracting those same type of duties out. We do have some contracted operators on the line today. They generally provide direction and policies. So this would be basically frameworks in which the employees or the contracted operators should approach various situations. They have a fiduciary duty, and then like all highly regulated systems, they have a duty to follow applicable laws. So this webinar today and the work of the EFCN network is brought to you basically by EPA recognizing that management and finances matter a lot in how water systems, whether or not they reliably provide safe drinking water that meets all applicable laws. But boards and commissions are also governed by laws that are not part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. There might be state water rights laws. There might be, there certainly is tax law, human resources law, non-discrimination, that sort of thing. So boards and commissions, if you step back and think about it, have quite a bit on their plate. We'll be talking about different types of setups. So the multidiscipline board is typified by elected officials within a community. So somebody would run for mayor or city councilman. That person would then have a seat on their board, which governs their water utility, and they typically are responsible for a pretty broad swath of other duties. So most municipalities run their own sewer system. Many of them run their own water system. But then it falls into the other public works. It might look at streets, snow removal, sidewalks. Often emergency services are also under the purview of an elected city or county commission. So they would also have governance over police, fire, ambulance, things like parks. And sometimes with larger communities, you can even get into they own the hospital. They might be involved with the educational system, so it can get pretty broad. And why I bring up this distinction is that a multidiscipline board can often be stretched pretty thin in that they have to try to be knowledgeable in a wide variety of things where the average citizen is not necessarily knowledgeable in all those things. So when there's a new elected official in a multidiscipline board, they can often take some time to get to know everything that's going on in the community. And part of your role as an employee of that type of system is to help them bring them up to speed. So things like just discussing basics of your utilities. Where does your water come from? How many miles of pipe? Do you treat it or not? Do you have any big projects coming up? So certainly on a multidiscipline board, there's a pretty steep learning curve when somebody joins in on that. And employees of that type of board should recognize that. Then we have a lot of limited scope boards. So these are things like most rural water districts would have a limited scope board that more or less the board is in charge of one or maybe a few things. Rural water district would be a classic example of they only really have one thing they oversee, and that tends to allow for a lot more expertise to be built up within the board members themselves. We also have something that's often called a Public Utility Commission, and that is a governance structure that is typically appointed by, say, a city council or county commissioners. So it's people who have generally not been elected and typically have a limited scope of governance that they're supposed to do a pretty good job on. And public utility commissions often will run 2, 3, or 4 different types of utilities. These often are pretty well-run systems in that you kind of separate some of the political from the technical and managerial of the utility. So limited scope boards have a lot of advantages in that they typically have more time and energy to devote to utility-specific issues. But there are disadvantages to that scenario too, in that they're often less likely to see the larger picture. So you know, the utilities you guys operate very much influence other things within the communities where you live. So you know, are you taking into account what fire needs are if you're reporting to a board that only has a limited scope over, say, the water and sewer system? So that's basically the types of setups we have out there. There are also for-profit utilities that are set up for shareholders. They have another set of responsibilities that most of the public commissions don't, in that they are supposed to earn a return on investment for the shareholders of that. But broadly, they have a lot of the same responsibility and oversight as any of these other boards I've talked about. So what kind of role does a board member and the board itself play within a utility? Board members, again, the vast majority of water system board members have been elected to the position or appointed. They do need to be a good team member in that we have all seen government dysfunction, and that is generally not the norm out there. But if you have bad feelings between board members, you often end up with a scenario where nothing will get done even when things do need to get done, and oversight might not be as good as it should have been because they're worried about other issues. Boards broadly need to develop long-term goals to protect the health of their community. So water obviously is tied to public health. Unfortunately, we've seen that in the news a lot lately, and the financial sustainability of the system. So board members often have to do a lot of kind of thankless tasks with regards to budgeting and capital improvement planning, but that's definitely in their purview. Also, boards broadly, when they're operating a utility, they are to set policies. If they have the ability to set law, they can also do some of these actions that way as well, so that your utility can operate both effectively and legally. This can be things with regards to payment of bills for customers, service level expectations, to things like human resources. So what is your vacation policy? What's your policy on, do you have any preferences for, say, veteran employment? So it can be pretty broad, and typically larger systems have more policies, but that's something that is kind of up at the local level of the boards there. the boards will almost always oversee finances, so many utilities that are represented on this webinar are probably under some sort of legal obligation to produce an annual budget. Most municipalities in most states have that sort of a requirement, and then it's just good practice to do that. So that's, you know, adopting an annual budget is kind of the bread and butter of board members' role in a utility. Also, again, this webinar is a little more complicated because it is nationwide, but the idea that acting transparently is required of board members. So most states have some sort of what's called a sunshine law, in that if you have public meetings, they are supposed to be open to the public, maybe notices posted somewhere, maybe agendas are made available, that minutes are kept. So basically there's open meetings and open records types of laws in most places, and most water systems operate under an organization that generally would fall under a Sunshine Act type of law. So the board is definitely required to act transparently. So this means no behind the door deals, be upfront with both the challenges and solutions to the problems that a water district might be facing. Board members also play an important role in communicating with customers. As elected officials, they often are invited to things like Rotary Club and other civic groups, and that is a definite role that board members have, is to tell the story of the utilities and everything else they oversee. So we have a lot of employees of water systems who are on the webinar today, and ultimately the board has the ability to employ you. So you might ask, what is my responsibility to the board? First of all, it's kind of going back to your job description. What are you required? Whether you're in the plant operation or the distribution system or the customer service side, you have certain things you're expected to do. So doing those is definitely meeting some of your responsibility to the board, running the system. Implementing and enforcing policies, again, this would be the policies that are applicable to your job. If you're a water plant operator and you don't deal on the billing side, you would be not implementing policies with regard to customer service, late payments, and things like that. Maintaining financial records, every system should be doing this, and you may or may not be required as part of your job description, but it's always good to know the finances of the organization at which you work. Obviously, operating, maintaining, repair, managing, and replacing assets are all important jobs to ensure long-term compliance with Drinking Water Act regulations. Depending on where you are in the country and your water supply status and your infrastructure, implementing a water loss control program is to some degree becoming mandatory. But broadly, running things efficiently, both on the energy side and water loss, is a responsibility that employees have to their employer. Providing customer service, even if you think you may not be on the customer service side, maybe you're out in the field all day, you know, being that good face for the utility, being polite to customers, answering their questions when they see you maybe operating a fire hydrant or running valves or something like that. Finally, there is a responsibility to keep the board informed of what's going on. This illustration of the board and staff relationship is one of many that could be shown here, but basically most decisions of boards require staff implementation. So they might implement a new policy on, say, late payments. Maybe they adopt a new resolution with regards to backflow prevention. Generally, the board members are not the people going to be doing that, and the staff will be doing it. There are, however, some board decisions that will not involve staff implementation. So maybe if a board was needing to condemn property to build a new water tower, that would probably be like the lawyer of the board and not the staff who would be implementing with that. So anyway, staff implements the board decision. Generally, when there's a change made, there should be communication back and forth. How is this change going? So the staff would provide feedback to the board. The customers would generally be updated if it was a policy that definitely had customer side impacts. So the customers would be updated definitely if you were changing payment terms, for example, that the board had decided to do that. However, there would be some decisions that boards would make that would have really no relevance to the vast majority of customers. So maybe changing goals of reserves being held on the financial side. I don't think most customers would have a lot of input or feedback on that type of operation. So this relationship, this diagram is not perfect for every scenario, but it shows how a lot of board, staffs, and customers will interact. So this communication is about communicating with your board. So for those who are employed full-time operating a water system, you might be spending 40 or 50 hours a week doing your job, and you might meet with your board maybe once or twice a month for a couple hours. So obviously there's more information that you have that you could communicate than what probably should be communicated, particularly for those multidisciplinary boards where they have to also talk with the director of the parks and the streets people and cover a lot more ground in that meeting. So boards do need to know certain things, and generally they do not need to know other things. And these will change depending on the size of your system and whether you have a multidiscipline board or a single discipline board. So compliance status, obviously if your system is out of compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act, that is something that does rise to the top that needs to be detailed. And also if it looks like your system is trending in that direction, here in the Midwest we have a lot of systems trending towards noncompliance with nitrates. That is something to inform the board about. Large operational changes, so in my experience in utility operations, customers notice when water quality will change, even if it's not at all a risk to health. So if you have, say, multiple sources of supply and you switch from one to the other, people will probably notice a change in taste. So just kind of give a heads up, hey, we're switching to the reservoir and turning off the well field in 2 weeks. That sort of thing just kind of keeps the surprises down for board members. Boards generally need to know water supply status, and this would be both the quantity and the quality, particularly as a lot of surface water supplies are having more blue-green algae problems. So if there's an issue with the water supply and or if it's just fine, that's a good thing for board members to know. If there are concrete goals that are required to be tracked, so maybe the board has adopted certain performance goals for the utility, the results of that need to be shown to board members. It's always a good idea to recognize exceptional employees. Board members like to see that employees sometimes go above and beyond, and it also helps with employee morale and retaining those good employees. Boards need to know bad news, particularly if it relates to compliance status or it's really expensive, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. They need to know the resources that are required to operate the system. It seems like there's a lot of water and sewer systems that have been kind of making do for a lot of years due to various situations, but this is part of the budgetary process that the staff of the water system tells the board of directors, this is what we need to operate. And the resources required to operate is not just a pile of money. It needs to be detailed, so broken down into various line items such as chemicals, energy use, salaries, contracted operations, and any other variety of what may be required there. So to really kind of show the various types of expenditures and resources needed to operate the system. The boards do need to know an overview of the asset condition, but they don't need to know a super detailed status of the assets. So if your system is, an overview of the asset condition would be something like water loss. It would be maybe the age of your pipeline infrastructure, maybe the number of main breaks per mile you have, so things you can possibly benchmark with other systems. They also need to be given a heads up if there's a large issues with the contractor. So if it looks like a construction project is starting to go badly, that's something they need to be informed about. Obviously, how those issues are resolved are very much a case-by-case thing, but it's better to give them a heads up early before you get in too far into a project. There's also things board members really don't need to know. Everybody encounters a lot of day-to-day problems, and these would typically not be something to talk about with board members. However, those day-to-day problems that relate to things that are commonly recurring should be kept track of. So if you are having maybe fuses tripping all the time, breakers tripping on electrical items, logging those day-to-day problems and presenting them maybe at budget time to say, hey, we need to upgrade this electrical infrastructure, that is something they do need to know, just not on a day-to-day basis. For the most part, board members don't need to know how to operate the system. They should know kind of what is required to operate the system, but not be able to go and operate the system. However, I have met quite a few board members who are certified operators for various systems, so this is not like everything else in this presentation is a generalization, and there actually are board members out there who are certified operators. Minor employee issues, if an employee had problems showing up 5 minutes late to work and you were able to rectify it, that sort of thing doesn't need to be brought to board members' attention. Likewise, minor customer issues, maybe a customer didn't understand a bill. Everybody, after explanation, everybody seemed to leave the situation happy. That's something that you probably don't need to discuss with your board on a regular status. They don't need to know a detailed status of your assets, so with the exception of if you're asking for reinvestment in it. So you don't need to detail 3 pages of documentation on your system's water tower, with the exception of when it's time to budget to maybe paint the tower or replace it. Most of the issues with your service providers also don't need to be detailed. Maybe your chemical delivery was late this month. If it wasn't a problem and you were otherwise happy with the vendor, that's something you probably don't need to share with the board members. And also minutia of purchasing decisions. When you're narrowing down what needs to be, what resources you need, what specific products you need, everything you've weighed is probably not required to be detailed to the board members. They can always ask you, but you don't have to weigh every single factor in that purchasing decision. So how do you effectively communicate with them now that we've talked kind of what you need to talk about and what you maybe don't need to talk about? First of all, knowing your audience is critically important. Hopefully, you have the ability to meet with them in a non-business environment, just kind of get to know them. That's always a good thing. You can appeal to their personalities. Are they super logical and want tables and graphs? Or are they a pretty emotional type of personality? Are there certain triggers to avoid possibly while meeting with them in an open meeting? It's important, very, very important, to never lie or guess when you're in an open meeting with a board of directors. You might get asked a question by one of them, and you might think you know, but if you really don't know, the answer should be, I don't know, and or I will look into it. Very rarely do we have something that's so immediately important that it can't wait till the next meeting. And one thing to always keep in mind is that the first thing you tell somebody tends to be what sticks. So if you would tell a board member, it'll take $100,000 to rectify the situation, and in reality it's $200,000, they're going to ask you why the huge discrepancy. So always, tell them, I'll get back to you on that. It's important to keep the cool. We've probably all seen some of those cases where there's a lot of unprofessional activity, both with board members and or staff. There's always another meeting coming up. So if you're failing, if you think that the communication is not going well, you can always ask to discuss in a future meeting. So I think a lot of times we look at our water systems and they tend to be, kind of decaying in their quality. So the infrastructure is getting older, more and more problems are coming up, but that's not really enough from a board of directors perspective to hear from an employee. They probably recognize that there's a problem, but they largely will not know, well, how do we proceed with tackling this problem? So the classic journalism here, who, what, when, where, why, and how, are critically important when you are trying to communicate issues to board members. So generally, when should we communicate? Mostly at regular meetings. You're a professional organization that's hopefully well run, and most of the communications can be done on your regular monthly or every other week meeting. And one reason this is important to do is that it helps maintain compliance with open meetings laws, where if you might be getting a quorum, if you run into them on the street, you might be in violation of that. So generally at regular meetings is the time to communicate with them, particularly all of them at a time. Prior to the meeting, hopefully you have meeting agendas that the board runs off a meeting agenda, and if they don't, I would strongly recommend that they look into that practice. It tends to have a lot more effective and efficient meeting. You might have presentation materials, possibly product brochures, maybe information from your consultants. That sort of information is good to include in a meeting agenda. However, if you have a whole lot of, 50 pages of stuff, a staff note with information summary and maybe a recommendation is good to include. Cost and financing are important to include if there is a cost impact to it. And again, that written summary, that just because you have information from the consultant doesn't necessarily mean that the board members would understand the language they're talking in. Water has a lot of specific terms that if you're not in the water industry, you might not really understand what's going on. So, having that interpretation from staff is pretty important to have. So, when do you communicate what is another thing. Generally, pressing issues, income, expenses, and water sales should be reported on about a monthly basis. Most communities are probably already doing the income, water sales, and expenditures on a monthly basis. Quarterly, you should look at capital purchases and plans. So you might have something budgeted for this year, kind of give an update on those capital purchases. Where are we? So you might tell them, we're in final design with our water tower replacement. Just giving people a heads up, giving them no surprises, letting them know when things are out to bid, that sort of thing is a good thing to show on about a quarterly basis or so. Annually, the results of the consumer confidence report, so basically telling them hopefully your water meets all requirements. And then if the organization does an annual report, obviously that would be on an annual basis as well. So there's a certain level of detail. Again, this goes back to the fact that you work full-time with a specific water system. You can tell them far more detail than you probably need to tell a board member about when you're communicating what you're doing in your operation. So with the level of detail, there's a couple things to think here. One is that the board members, do they actually need to know it? Are they going to be interested in it? Is it going to be helpful to them? And also, if you give too much detail, that opens up something called a window for micromanagement. So if you're making a recommendation, when you compare options, don't show 17 or 28 different options. That's just too many, and it allows for a lot of second guessing to go on. The board of directors has probably hired you largely based upon your experience and expertise with the water system. And in that type of a relationship, they often rely on the expertise of their staff and defer to them if it seems like they're making a reasonable case. So giving too many options is a great way to not ever get anything done. I don't want you, I'm not trying to advocate that you hide things from them, but at the same time, you know, decisions ultimately do have to be made. It's also important to steer board to the discussion of substantive items. So you want to worry about the capacity of, say, your pumping units, and because that's important, you want to worry about its reliability. You don't want to worry about the color of the motors attached to the pumping units, because that really is truly not important, not in line with goals for operating a good water utility and providing good customer service. So highlight the important differences. So this would be an example if you were buying something, life expectancy, warranty, expected maintenance cost, energy usage, labor needs. Those are all important to highlight. What color something is, not so important to the future of your water utility. How do you effectively communicate, though? In my previous position, I was in charge of stormwater management, and these two photos are from that job. They tell you a lot. Any person off the street could look at these two photos and say, oh, you know, that's not in very good shape. Falling brick, rust, those are good things to take. So take photos to illustrate the problem. Tours are also great if you're working with treatment plants. They show the complexities and the amount of work necessary to operate them. So when you're asking for resources to reinvest in a treatment plant, if the board members are knowledgeable that there might be 5 or 8 steps of water treatment, and there's this many pumps, this many motors, this many chemical feeds, they're more likely to reinvest in that because they know the complications and the intricacies a little better about that type of treatment plant. Another thing you might be able to do is to actually take stuff into the board meeting. I've taken pieces of pipe before. Certainly if you're working on a water main project, taking coupons or pipe that you've removed from main breaks is very illustrative of the problem you're facing in your system, much more than a map that might show all of your main breaks throughout your community. So think about how you can effectively communicate the problems you're facing that you're wanting the board's assistance in tackling. I tend to think the how to proceed is the most important. Obviously, you need to make a good case that there's a problem here, we need to tackle it, but the board members are specifically going to rely on your expertise and sometimes some outside expertise to know how do we proceed forward. The board absolutely needs a reasonable option. Again, you can't just tell them there's a problem. You have to have some sort of solution at hand. And it's important to note, if you have a problem, you might not know the answer. So outsourcing it, so that could be a consultant, that could be an outside contractor, and possibly saying, hey, I need more time to research this. You've posed me with good questions at this board meeting, and I need more time to look into it. And all of those are very reasonable things to do. Sometimes water systems will have issues and they might be substantial, but you don't know enough yet. So this would be something, again, board members tend to not like surprises. So if you feel there is a substantial issue coming up, inform them of it, even with incomplete information, and then definitely make a strong effort to give them all the information they need at the next regularly scheduled meeting you might have. So how do we present options? So a lot of operators, utility managers will talk to the board, and the board, again, often will want to maybe micromanage, But how do you present those options so that you're clear, that you're fair to the various options out there? Here's some do's and here's some do nots. This is not a complete list. Just like everything else in this webinar, there's way too many water systems and different governance structures to cover everything perfectly. But basically, when you're presenting options, first of all, be honest. Be honest about the scope of the problem. Be honest about the likelihood of solution. Detailing life cycle costs is very, very important. Particularly with municipal operations and county operations, there's a very strong bias towards low-cost bid, and that can be pretty detrimental in that low-cost bid is often not the low cost when it looks at life cycle costing. So do a good job showing the various maintenance costs, showing the labor, showing the consumables of some items. Detailing life cycle costs makes board members a lot more comfortable when they're voting to spend public funds. It's important to evaluate fairly, so this would go back to life cycle costing. Make sure you're not neglecting an important factor of the life cycle cost. So if item A requires twice the labor as item B, make sure that labor is involved in the life cycle costing of the comparison analysis. It's always important to also explain do nothing, in that a lot of the decisions that board members make, there actually is kind of the status quo as we keep on doing and don't do anything differently. But do nothing needs to be explained. Sometimes it's would increase risk to the system. Sometimes it might increase cost. Sometimes do nothing might fully make your system out of compliance. That needs to be well illustrated when you're discussing items of concern with your board members. Generally, it's a good idea to provide financing options. So at the minimum, depending on how your budget is set up, you would say, we recommend this item or this service be paid for out of equipment replacement reserves. That is something that makes it easier for board members to make a decision. And you can also say, what kind of impact does this have on the equipment reserve fund? Now, when we get into super large capital expenditures of $500,000 or more, providing the financing options is probably going to be more on the consultant side, though certainly people on this webinar would be involved in that as well. And that's when you need to really show that you've done your due diligence with the various financiers out there. It's important to provide graphics, things like photos again, to show what you currently have and also what you may have in the future. And if it's something you truly do have a strong opinion on, it's important to give it. This is again where boards rely on their employees' expertise, and if it's something where you truly do have a strong opinion that this is in the best interest of our customers, of water quality, of safety of our system, now is the time to present it. There are some things you shouldn't do. Jumping to conclusions almost always gives you problems. Don't assume that the board will not have good input. I have been before boards before. Thought I had a pretty good game plan, and the board had some very good points, and we came back and modified things, and things were better after that. Don't risk compliance. So this kind of goes back to the explaining the do nothing option, that compliance with the regulations is always of utmost importance because it relates directly to the health of the population in your communities. Again, going back to the life cycle costing, don't unfairly burden some options. So, truly try and be as objective as you can in explaining the options to them. And finally, don't believe that board members can't take bad news. These people have probably heard bad news from, particularly in a multimedia board, the police department or fire department or parks board. They're going to be able to take bad news. Try not to sugarcoat, because when you do that, problems don't typically solve themselves. They will need board input to be solved. Finally, as this webinar is wrapping up, I'd like to talk about communication in special situations. The first of these is acute health violations. Hopefully you never have this, But there's a decent likelihood that you might somewhere along the line in your career in water. First and foremost, follow whatever the regulator is telling you. Do not try and change the words in the public notice. Do not try and extend the time frame for it. Do whatever they require you to do. Secondly, you need to inform the board. They are going to get questions about what this means. So it's important to know that there are additional communicators for your system. Make sure they understand what's going on, what the violation is, what it means to the health of the population, what type of time frame there might be to repair the problem, and what can and might be done in the future to prevent recurrence. So acute health violations may or may not be the fault of the system. Sometimes water quality can happen that's really out of the system's control. You need to detail these types of things to your board members so that they can be good advocates on the behalf of the water utility. Finally, the special situation of emergencies. I will go into the Kansas stereotypes, and that I have talked with a lot of people who have actually responded to tornado emergencies. And in a tornado, a water system will typically lose water pressure because every house and building that's taken out suddenly is they're full open taps. So you have a huge amount of water demand when buildings are wiped out by tornadoes. And so this becomes both a preparedness thing and also detailing the problem to your board of directors. So first of all, know your natural disaster risk. Know where floods are likely to happen, if you're earthquake prone, if tornadoes, windstorms, power outages caused by things like ice storms. All of these things can impact water systems negatively, so knowing the risks are important. Detailing those at some point to the board, hopefully before it happens, also critical. Again, detail the specific problem at hand to the best of your ability with board members once the emergency has occurred. 5 W's and H. Use your board members to communicate what's going on. Oftentimes communication is broken down within communities during emergencies. Hopefully the chain of command gets established, but the average citizen on the street might call up their city councilor and let them be well understanding of what's at hand. It's important not to overpromise when an issue is going to be resolved. Most of us have never been through a massive flood or tornado or hurricane, so we don't really know what is required to get things back up and running after the disaster has happened. So don't say water is going to be back on in 8 hours, because you probably cannot reliably say that that is going to occur. It's important to use the board members to obtain resources. So you might be fighting literally fire sometimes, and the board members, the chain of command for the emergency plan can be used to obtain things like mutual aid. It's also important to know that the board members are generally seen as they're your system's boss, but when emergencies happen, they're people too. They might have had their home blown away. They might have had family or friends hurt or even killed. So understand during emergencies there's likelihood that people will have emotions that you might not have seen from them before, and to understand that everybody is personally impacted by these things. If you feel it is useful and if you have a plan to restart operations, try and detail it to the board members, but importantly, use them as another resource within your system during emergencies. We'll wrap this up with questions, so I think I'll turn it back over to the Syracuse CFC.
Hello. Thank you very much, Nick. We do have a question. The question is, how do you rank fiduciary responsibility in comparison with other board responsibilities?
I'm not an attorney, but I think generally that would be considered the highest.
Nick, are you still there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. It just cut out really quickly.
Okay.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, I do have 2 more polling questions for you. The first one is, would you like to subscribe to the Environmental Finance Center blog? We're just giving a couple seconds so everyone can answer. Thank you. And the second poll, if you are a small water system, 10,000 or fewer people served, are you interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance? Also providing a few seconds so answers can come in. Thank you. Well, at this time, it seems as if we have no more questions. Nick, you have been extremely thorough and proficient in how to communicate with your board. Thank you for your time. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we wrap up?
No, I don't believe so. Thanks for attending.
Thank you for presenting. And I have one more official survey link to send out. Please take the survey link for today's webinar. If you have a chance, just take some time to tell us your thoughts on the webinar today, and you will also receive a follow-up email with the survey link, as well as the link to the slides and the recording. All right. Thank you so much, and have a great day.